Hey there! Welcome to our lecture on GIS data and spatial data models. Whoa, I think I need a glass of water, some caffeine, or maybe just work on speech. So let's try that again. GIS data and spatial data models. Now, what does all of this mean? Because I'm sure you're riveted and just jumping out of your seats. What are we going to start off with? We're going to start off on what is GIS data, what are data models, learn about a few different kinds of data, and then in this week's lab in our video demos, we're also going to learn how to translate what the learning part is and what the doing part is and why this learning part is so important. Okay, so first off, maybe we should back up for a second and think about what is data anyway. Data is a word that is something we use. It's very ubiquitous. We use it a lot. What essentially does it mean? It's information. There's information out there about so many things. Now, the amount of data that we have created and stored over the last 20 years has been the most data that the world has ever generated and stored in the history of humankind. So, what does that mean for us as GISers? Yes, the amount of data that we have now is overwhelming, but in the last 20 years, it's become readily available for us. Why does that matter for us as GISers? Because when we talk about GIS data, it's a specific and particular type of data that we want to use. In our last lecture, yes, we learned that there are different kinds of data. There's spatial data and non-spatial data. As GISers, do we use both? The answer is absolutely yes. What is the most important to us? It's the spatial realization of that data so that we can communicate it in a visual way and create, as we're going to talk in this lecture a little bit later, create models, static and non-static models that we can share with others in order to communicate information. So, when we're learning about spatial data or GIS data, in order to create a GIS, you must take a real world situation. So, a certain geographic, all that means is a specific location with information, which means data, and transform it or create it and get it onto a computer so that we can interpret it and then we can view it or we can display it. So, for example, if you're looking at this image, here's what the real world looks like. Well, can we communicate that in a photo or an image or in a satellite display? Yes, absolutely. But when we're trying to communicate some sort of data or specific information, we're going to create these models, or sometimes we call them layers, so that we can take this information using certain kind of files and create a GIS. So information that's shown in a spatial or a certain geographic area. So, what kind of GIS data is out there? So, GIS data can be separated into two categories. Now, we've already talked about the spatially referenced data. Spatial, what does that mean? Anything in a given amount of space. Does it matter what it is? Could it be scientific? Could be about the natural world? It could be about social justice. You choose what it gets to be about. Now, this spatial data is going to be represented by using vector data and raster data or forms. Both of these include imagery, which is great because most human beings, we learn and we are communicated to in the strongest way possible using visual methods. So this is going to represent the spatial aspect of the data. Now remember that sometimes we have data that's non-spatial. So this attribute information can be used. It's just as important. It's going to be the non-spatial part of the information that we're trying to communicate to people. So within the spatially referenced data group, a GIS data can be further classified into vector and raster. Most GIS software applications focus on the usage and manipulation of vector geodatabases and raster geodatabases. And we're going to talk about what a geodatabase is in just a minute. So these models that we are trying to create based off of real life, real world, real things so we can communicate this to people. It's going to be vector, raster, and then we've also got networks, geodatabase, and more. Let's start first with vector data. What is vector data? Vector data. I just go Star Trek on this one. It's kind of where my brain goes. Vector data is going to be split into 3 types. Now remember, we're talking geography, so we're talking locations. We're talking a given amount of space. Vector data is going to be separated into 3 different types: a point, a line or an arc, or a polygon. What does that mean? Points are going to be represented like locations, like cities, or like in our lab this week, it's going to be represented by campgrounds. It's going to be defined by a single coordinate, a single point. A line is going to be a feature comprised of a series of straight line segments or mathematical curves, roads, rivers, something that represents a line. A polygon is going to be a closed feature, a certain region. For example, if you're looking at this image, a county. Raster data is going to be the other sort of geographical, spatially referenced data that we use mostly, and it's going to be a representation of the world as a surface divided into grids. So it's like, for example, when we started looking at all these new fancy TVs and we talked about pixels and pixelated. So raster data is stored in what we call cells or pixels. And these can be satellite aerial images, elevations, DEMs. We'll talk about those in just a minute. So, what is the difference between both, and why and when do we use vector versus raster data? It really all depends on where the data comes from and then how do we use it. So, objects are going to be defined by geometrics, points, lines, and polygons. These are our vector data. So, each object is going to be a feature or a row in a GIS database. A database is going to be the place where all of this information is stored. These attributes are going to be like the attribute table that we were talking about, are going to be the information that's associated with these features. So this could also be the non-spatial or spatial information about these points, lines, or polygons. Raster data is going to be a representation of the world and divided into these cells. Attributes are going to be associated with each cell and the information inside of each cell, whereas vector, the attribute information is associated with each feature, whether it be a point, a line, or a polygon. So that's a little bit of the difference between each of these spatially type of reference data. Now, again, let's go in and think about the difference between vector data and raster data. So here is a point, which is a vector data, and that's a point. It's a single coordinate on a y-x axis. Another sort of vector data is a line. It's going to be a connected series of points or an arc. An area is going to be a closed feature or a polygon. Now, if we take this down into this visual representation of a raster data model, raster data is going to be used using pixels or cells. So all of the information inside of this singular cell is going to be stored in a geodatabase. So again, going back and really diving deep into spatial data. What is a vector? What is a vector? It's going to be a point, a line, a polygon, or some sort of a node, something that has vertices representing the start and the end of a feature. So let's go ahead and get started with point data. Point data is most commonly used to represent non-adjacent features and to represent discrete data points. And we will talk about discrete and non-discrete data in just a minute. So in GIS, point data can be used to show geographic locations of cities, or as I've said in our lab this week, about campground sites. Point features can also be used to represent abstract points. Now, if we take it a step further and we start talking about line data or arc data, it's used to represent linear features. Like, for example, you're going to see rivers and you're going to see roads, trails, streets. They have only one dimension and therefore can only be used to measure length. They have a starting point and an end point. Our examples from this are roads, streams, and in the hydrology, a dashed blue line. Let's take this map a step further and go ahead and add in our third example of vector data, which is polygon. They're used to represent areas, lake, forest, or like in our lab, a region. They're usually most commonly associated using thematic mapping, symbology, which is, you'll notice that symbology for these metropolitan areas is a darker yellow than this creamy color on the outside, more rural areas. So how do we represent the Earth using vector data? Now, in these features over here to the side, you'll notice that we've got points, lines that are associated with the roads, and polygons associated with the buildings. Vector data file types are going to be represented by within a geodatabase, within a feature class, different features like cities, rivers, streets. They're also going to be considered shape files as well. So here we have a simple aerial image of an urban location. We're going to take it a step further, and now we have points that represent each of these intersections. We're going to take it a step further and add the lines represent the streets that connect to the center lines or these intersections. Now we add the polygons represented by the building footprints. Now, when we move on to thinking about raster data, it's a little bit different. It can be a little bit more abstract and harder to understand. So if you take, for example, thinking about the world, maybe if you've worked outside in the wilderness taking samples, right? And you put down your grid system and you take samples from each one of those inside of those grids and you scan that entire area. So raster data is going to be a representation of the world divided into these grids or into these pixels. Now, there are going to be attributes associated with each of these cells, and you get to choose what that's going to be, right? Now, when we come to talk about continuous and discrete data, raster data is going to be more commonly used for continuous data, like data that has no stopping or stopping point, like rainfall or elevation, for example. Now, within these pixels and cells, there's going to be a picture element, the smallest cell of information in this raster data. Each pixel is going to be a single cell, like a row or a column in a GIS data set. Each cell is going to have an attribute or value, and that represents features. And it's only one value per cell. That is the reason why raster data is so hard to pull up and why sometimes you need a really great computer. Now, with the onset of ArcGIS Online, it's a lot easier because if we're doing it online, their services are actually pulling from that raster data. Raster data is heavy and it takes up a lot of space. What are some examples of raster data? So elevation. when you're going to look at aerial images, for example, of where's the higher elevation in this map that I'm circling here? Where do we get that information from? Where do we get that data? We get it from DEMs or LiDAR. We get it from digital elevation models or LiDAR, which is light detecting and ranging. How do we get that? We get that from airborne imagery, satellite, a lot of classified data. What does this help us with? It helps a lot with land use. You'll go ahead and see an example of raster data over here to the side as well. Here's an example of an elevation model. If you take this single cell here, you'll see a detailed view of all of the other cells within this cell. So raster data, if you're able to zoom in on it, each cell has a certain sort of information, each pixel, if that's what you would like to also consider it as well. Sometimes learning about these things, it's a little bit easier when we have a comparison. So if we take this on the left-hand side, we have our vector examples, and on the right-hand side, we have our raster examples. So here we've got point features explained using vector analysis. Now, if we would use the raster points on the right-hand side, you're going to notice that that's represented a little bit differently using point features and raster data because it's more pixelated. Again, when we try to represent that using vector line features and then we translate that over to raster features, you're also going to notice that that is displayed and communicated in very different ways. Raster data file types are going to include grids on Esri, images, you've got TIFF files, you've got JPEG-2 files, and other imaging. The advantages of using raster data is it's simple, but some of the disadvantages, there can be cartographic limitations when you're trying to communicate something, and also the data sets are extraordinarily large. Now, this brings us to a point where we talk about the difference between different kinds of data. Now, the reason why we come here is because vector and raster data both live within discrete and continuous data, but usually one is used more often. So discrete and continuous data are two ways of presenting data in GIS to talk about spatial elements, which are just real world places. Discrete data constitutes a separate, distinct entity. So it's defined by an absolute location. So these data and map art features are easily represented in our vector data, which is points, lines, and polygons. Sometimes we call that areas as well. So continuous data is represented and it constitutes regular, uninterrupted surface. This is seen throughout the mapped area and smoothly transitions from one value to another. And this is really where raster data comes in handy. So discrete data is also known as categorical or discontinuous because although raster data you can find in discrete as well, most commonly associated with vector. A discrete object has a known and definable boundary. It's easy to define where it starts and where it stops. So, for example, a lake is a discrete object with a surrounding landscape. We know where the water's edge meets the land and we know how to define it. Then if we take continuous data, it represents phenomena where each location on the surface is a measure of the concentration or a relationship from a fixed point. Continuous data is also referred to as field, non-discrete, obviously, which would be the opposite of discrete, or surface data. Derived from the characteristics that define a surface where each location is measured from a fixed point. This includes elevation, aspect, like aspect meaning direction. Continuous features are not spatially discrete. They transition between possible values on a continuous surface that do not have an abrupt or well-defined break in between them. Why do we need to know about this? Because what we're trying to learn to do is take the real world and define it or create a model for others to go ahead and look at and also learn from. That's what we're all trying to do. So these models are going to be a set of rule or constructs used to describe and represent something real world, except on a computer. And we can create digital representations, but we're going to be limited. So it's important to understand where we get the data, how we're going to best use it. Here are some examples of other GIS data models. We're not really going to be using any of these, but I thought it would be important that if you'd like to go on and learn more about it, I wanted to make sure to include this slide. Now, getting back to what I said we were going to learn about is a geodatabase. What is it? So now we're taking the word data, we're adding the word geo, right? So what does that mean? Geo meaning a certain amount of space. It's going to have a spatial reference to it. Does it mean that we're going to be using non-spatial data in our geodatabase as well? Absolutely. So it's going to be a database that is in some way referenced to somewhere on the earth. So we're going to have data that is usually known as an attribute table, which is a lot of the time going to be non-spatial data associated with a spatial area. So this attribute data is generally defined as additional information and can be tied to a spatial area. So this database is going to be a container for all of our spatial data. Our vector data is going to be vector data, which are going to be our points, lines, and polygons. They're going to be stored as features. And our raster data is going to be managed or linked. Now, that's why it's also important sometimes to take Microsoft like Excel classes, because Esri and all of their work is very closely associated with Microsoft Access databases and is stored in a GDB format. This gets us to an idea of that next step, talking about metadata. What is metadata? Now, we've learned about data. What is metadata? Metadata is essentially data about your data. So if you would take, for example, this photo here, and at the very, very top of this iceberg, we're talking about data. The data, the world that we're living in, right? This could be visual, it can be spatial or non-spatial. Now, underneath you're going to see, right, the iceberg is mainly where most of it is underneath the water. This metadata underneath is going to be just as important because it's going to represent who made it, when was it made. It's going to be all of the information about our data. Now, it's important to know what is in your data and where it comes from. Like when you go to the store and you're shopping, it's important to know about what you're putting in your studies. If you are going to be doing the tough work and using this to represent something, using it to do something with it and explain it to other people, plead your case, it's important that you know the metadata, where your information is coming from. Is it junk food or is it a healthy, nutritious snack? Likewise, metadata does not tell you how to use GIS data. It's going to tell you where your data is coming from. So what can metadata tell me? It gives me the data set, the spatial extent, the coordinate system, descriptions of the data, how and when it was created, and who to contact. Now, a lot of times when we're on ArcGIS Online or Pro, we're able to go ahead and click on a point and we've got a pop-up and then you've got information and it's going to show us a little bit more about our data, which is going to be metadata. So how does a GIS work? How do we bring it all together? Now, we're integrating a lot of different features in order to create these models. So we're displaying information as layers, as you've already seen in our labs. We can turn off and turn on these layers. We've already started analyzing these layers, right, one at a time. So what are the steps in GIS? You capture How are you going to capture your information, your data? Where are you getting it from, right? Is it vector? Is it raster? So, vector, points, lines, and polygons, and raster is going to be a digital elevation model. Or if we're looking at air pollution, then we're going to store it. Where are we going to store it? Well, now we have this amazing ArcGIS Online. You have an account now. So if you want to find data, if you want to capture it on your own, I'm sure some of you have already done that in some of your field work. Then you're going to query it. You're going to challenge it. You're going to look within your data, ask questions, and say, how can I use this? Once you find the information that you want to, you find it, you're going to analyze it. We've already started doing that. You're going to display it so you look at it, and then you're going to output it. You're going to share it, or you're going to show other people how to use it. How can we capture this data? You can use your phone, you can use GPS. There are lots of different ways that you can do this. We store it. How are we going to store it? Obviously, have we learned about vector and rasta, and ultimately, how do we do this? It's within our geo database. Query, what does that mean? We're going to find specific features based on location or attribute. So here we're looking at Clackamas Community College. We've in our labs, we've already been learning how to look up our tables. We haven't really gone in too much and started working within our tables. We've added a little bit in lab 1, but we will continue to work on honing that skill as well. We have worked on analyzing, though, answering questions about the spatial relationships between the data sets, and then displaying. How are we going to visualize this? How are we going to display it? We also have classes on how can you create a map that's visually stimulating. And then we have our output, our map. Is it going to be paper, digital? We're learning how to share that. Are we going to include graphs and charts? Are we going to make it an infographic? Is it going to be more of a report? How are we going to integrate statistics? Or are we going to include animations? Are we going to put it on a website? So it really depends on your audience and what you're using for it as well. So I hope you really enjoyed, or at least were enlightened a little bit about this lecture, learning about what data is, what GIS data is specifically, the difference between non-spatial and obviously spatially referenced data, which we have vector and raster data, which is spatially referenced. We learned about what data models are, geodatabases, what is metadata, which is data about your data, and essentially how a GIS works. So if you have any questions on any of this, never hesitate to reach out to me. And I hope you're doing really, really well.